The Swanton Novers Rectory, the house that wept, OIL, the morning of August 8th, 1919 began. Like every other morning in the village of Swanton Novers, the rectory sat at the edge of the village the way English rectories always do, slightly apart. Slightly above, the kind of building that has always understood its own importance in the landscape it occupies. It was a solid, respectable building in the Norfolk countryside, surrounded by the flat agricultural land that stretches away in every direction in that part of England, under skies that seem wider and more open than skies anywhere else. The summer of 1919 was warm. The harvest was coming. The war had been over for 8 months, and the particular exhausted relief of a country that had spent 4 years. Losing a generation of its men was settling into something that was beginning, cautiously, to resemble ordinary life again. The Reverend Hayward lived at the rectory with his family. He was the incumbent of Swanton Novers Parish, a man of the church in a part of England where the church was still the central institution of community life. And his rectory was the kind of home that came with the position, large enough to be impressive, old enough to have its own particular atmosphere, maintained to a standard that reflected the dignity of the office it housed. The family had a servant, a girl of 15, who helped with the running of the household and who lived in the rectory as part of her employment. She was young and unremarkable and would, in any other year, have passed through her service at the rectory without leaving any mark on history whatsoever. The morning of August 8th changed the dot. The rector's wife was in the kitchen when she noticed, at first, something on the ceiling. A thin stream of liquid running down from a point near the window, tracking slowly across the plaster and dripping onto the floor below. She looked at it for a moment. A building as old as the rectory there were always small mysteries of this kind: condensation, minor leaks, the settlement of old structures around old pipes. She stepped closer. She looked more carefully. She reached up and touched the liquid where it had collected on the edge of a shelf, and she brought her fingers to her nose. It was not water. It was oil. Specifically, it smelled of sandalwood, the warm, woody, distinctly non-domestic scent of sandalwood oil, which had no place in a Norfolk rectory kitchen in August 1919, and no conceivable route by which it could have arrived on the ceiling and begun to run down the wall. She called her husband. He came. He looked. He touched it. He smelled it. He had no explanation. By the end of that first day, there were other streams. In the kitchen, in the hallway, in the rooms upstairs. Not all of them smelled of sandalwood. Some smelled of paraffin, some of petrol. Some had the quality of refined lamp oil. And some, strange in a different way from all the others, were simply water, appearing on dry surfaces in rooms that had not been rained on and had no proximity to any plumbing that could account for them. The Reverend Hayward documented what he was observing with the methodical care of an educated man confronted with something that did not fit within any framework he had available to him. He noted the locations. He noted the substances as best he could identify them. He noted the quantities, and the quantities were not small. On that first day, he estimated that several gallons of liquid had appeared on the surfaces of his rectory from sources he could not identify. He sealed rooms. He checked pipes. He examined the structure of the building with the thoroughness of someone who very much wanted to find a rational explanation and was increasingly unable to do so. The following day, it happened again. And the day after that. By the end of the first week, the rectory at Swanton Novers was producing oils, petrol, paraffin, sandalwood, and water from its walls and ceilings on a daily basis, in quantities that grew rather than diminished, and the Reverend Hayward had run out of conventional explanations entirely and had begun to understand that whatever was happening in his house was something that exceeded his capacity to address alone. He contacted the relevant authorities. Word reached the local press, and within days the rectory at Swanton Novers, a building that had stood quietly at the edge of its Norfolk village for generations, accumulating nothing more remarkable than the ordinary passage of parish life, had become the focus of an investigation that would bring chemists, geologists, surveyors, and journalists from across the country to a small corner of rural Norfolk to look at something that none of them could explain. The world that the Swanton Novers case happened in is worth understanding before the case itself, because the England of August 1919 was not a neutral backdrop for events of this kind. It was a country in the specific condition of aftermath. The First World War had ended 8 months earlier, in November 1918, and the process of absorbing what had happened, the scale of the loss, the particular quality of industrialized mass death, the 4 years of grinding attrition that had consumed an entire generation of young men from exactly the kind of rural Norfolk communities that surrounded Swanton Novers, was not something that resolved quickly or cleanly. It was something that was still happening, quietly and pervasively, in every household and every community in the country. The village of Swanton Novers was in this respect entirely typical. It was a small agricultural settlement in North Norfolk, the kind of place where the rhythms of the farming year had structured community life for centuries, and where the war had arrived as a violent disruption of everything that had previously seemed permanent. Men from Swanton Novers had gone to France and Belgium and the other theaters of a war that had no precedent in human experience. Some of them had come back, some had not. The village was living in August 1919 with that specific mixture of relief and grief and exhaustion that defined English rural communities in the immediate aftermath of the armistice. Into this world came the events at the rectory, a building that was supposed to represent stability and faith and the continuity of the institutional church in the life of a community that was trying to rebuild its sense of normalcy. A building from whose walls and ceilings something impossible was running every single day. The full catalog of what appeared at Swanton Novers Rectory between August 8th and September 8th, 1919 is, even at a century's distance, genuinely difficult to process. It is not simply that liquids appeared from the walls and ceilings of the building. It is the specific nature of those liquids, the quantities in which they appeared, the locations in which they appeared, and the pattern of their appearance that makes the Swanton Novers case resistant to every conventional explanation that has ever been proposed for it. The substances documented during the 30-day period included sandalwood oil, paraffin oil, petrol, methylated spirits, water, and what witnesses described as a refined lamp oil of a quality suitable for domestic use. These substances appeared on the walls, ceilings, floors, and furniture of multiple rooms throughout the rectory. They appeared in rooms that were locked and unoccupied. They appeared in rooms that were occupied and under direct observation. They appeared in quantity sufficient to pool on floors and saturate furnishings. On the worst day of the 30-day period, the total volume of liquid that appeared in the rectory was estimated at approximately 50 gallons of mixed oils and liquids appearing from the walls and ceilings of a Norfolk rectory. In a single day, this number requires some pause. 50 gallons is approximately 227 liters. It is the quantity of liquid that a domestic household uses for all purposes over a significant period of time. It is a quantity that, if produced by a concealed water source such as a burst pipe, would have been immediately apparent in the structure of the building and would have left evidence of its root through the fabric of the walls that any competent surveyor would have identified within minutes of arriving on site. It is a quantity that, if introduced through any mechanical means by a person or persons working covertly, would have required equipment of considerable size and a sustained period of unobserved access to the building that the circumstances of the rectory made essentially impossible to arrange. The investigators who attended the rectory and measured and documented these quantities were not credulous people. They were professionals with specific expertise in the kinds of questions the Swanton Novers case raised. The chemists who took samples of the substances and analyzed them confirmed that they were what they appeared to be: real oils, real petrol, real paraffin, real water, all of commercial quality and composition. None of them produced naturally by any process associated with the materials from which the rectory was built. Stone and plaster and timber do not produce sandalwood oil. They never have. They never will. Whatever was producing the substances at Swanton Novers, it was not the building itself. The locations in which the substances appeared showed a pattern that investigators noted and that subsequent researchers have found significant. They did not appear uniformly throughout the building. They concentrated in certain rooms and at certain times of day. They appeared most frequently and in greatest quantity in the areas of the rectory that were most regularly occupied by the household, the kitchen, the main living spaces, the rooms used by the family and the servant girl in their daily routine. Rooms that were sealed and left unoccupied for extended periods showed less activity. Rooms that were in regular use showed more. This pattern, the concentration of phenomena in occupied rather than unoccupied spaces, was one of the features of the Swanton Novers case that later researchers identified as connecting it to the broader category of poltergeist phenomena. The pattern was consistent with what had been observed in other documented cases where physical disturbances appeared to be in some way responsive to the presence of specific people rather than simply occurring as independent physical events. It suggested that whatever was producing the oils and liquids at Swanton Novers was not a static property of the building itself, but was in some way connected to the people inside it, and was in some way responsive to where those people were and what they were doing. The substances themselves presented a puzzle that the chemists who analyzed them found particularly difficult to engage with. Each substance was genuine, each was of commercial quality, each had a specific smell and specific properties that identified it clearly as what it appeared to be. Sandalwood oil smelled of sandalwood. Petrol smelled of petrol. Paraffin smelled of paraffin. But none of them had any business being in the locations where they were found. The walls of a Victorian rectory in rural Norfolk do not contain reservoirs of sandalwood oil waiting to be released under the right conditions. The ceilings of a country house do not store petrol in quantities sufficient to produce 50 gallons of liquid in a day. The sources were impossible. The substances themselves were real. That combination, impossible source, genuine material, was the core paradox of the Swanton Novers case, and the thing that made it impossible for any investigator who attended in good faith to simply dismiss the streaming quality of the liquid. Appearance was also documented with care. The substances did not appear as sudden floods or dramatic eruptions. They appeared as thin streams running down wall surfaces in the way that condensation runs down a cold window on a warm day. Slowly, consistently, following the path of least resistance down the wall to pool on the floor or soak into whatever surface lay below. This controlled, gradual quality of appearance made concealed mechanical production, a hidden spray mechanism, a pressurized container releasing its contents through a small aperture, a theoretically possible but practically very difficult explanation, for reasons that the investigators who examined the structure of the building would make clear. The 30 days of the Swanton Novers phenomena were not 30 days of uniform activity. The events varied in intensity. Some days produced only minor quantities of one or two substances in one or two locations. Some days, of which the 50-gallon day was the most extreme, produced multiple substances in multiple rooms, simultaneously in quantities that saturated the building and made it temporarily uninhabitable. The pattern of variation was not random in any simple sense. It appeared to track something, some internal logic or external trigger that the investigators were unable to identify, but that witnesses consistently reported as feeling deliberate rather than mechanical. The Reverend Hayward documented everything with the systematic precision of a man who had been trained to keep records and who understood that whatever was happening in his home was something that posterity would want to know about. His records formed the backbone of the accounts that reached the press and the investigators who attended, and they were consistent with the independent accounts of every other witness who spent time at the rectory during the 30-day period. There were no significant discrepancies in the testimony, no contradictions that suggested fabrication or exaggeration. Everyone who was there saw the same things in the same locations, in the same quantities, and everyone who was there left unable to explain them. The first investigators to arrive at Swanton Novers Rectory were not paranormal researchers or ghost hunters. They were exactly the kind of professional specialists that a rational man confronted with an inexplicable physical phenomenon would call people with specific expertise in the material properties of buildings, liquids, and the soil beneath them. The surveyor came first. His job was to examine the structure of the rectory with the thoroughness of someone trained to understand how buildings work, where their vulnerabilities are, what routes water and other liquids can take through stone and plaster and timber. And what structural conditions can produce the kind of unexpected liquid? Appearances that might be mistaken for something more unusual than they actually are. He arrived at the rectory with his equipment and his professional confidence, and he spent a considerable amount of time examining the walls, the ceilings, the roof structure, the drainage, and the foundations. He found nothing. No concealed pipes, no hidden reservoirs, no structural defects that could account for the appearance of liquids in the quantities and locations that the Reverend Hayward had documented. The roof was intact. The walls were dry within their fabric, the dampness confined entirely to the streaks of liquid on their surfaces rather than penetrating the material of the walls themselves. The drainage was functioning correctly. The foundations showed no evidence of any underground source that could have been driving liquids upward through the building. The surveyor's conclusion, delivered with the careful qualification of a professional who understood what it meant, was that the physical structure of the rectory provided no conventional explanation for what was being reported. The geologist followed. His expertise was in the soil and subsoil beneath the rectory and the surrounding ground. The question of whether there was any natural underground source of oils or mineral liquids in the Norfolk geology that could conceivably, under some unusual set of circumstances, be finding its way to the surface and into the building. This was not as implausible as it might sound. There are recorded cases of naturally occurring mineral seeps and underground oil deposits that have produced unexpected surface appearances in various parts of the world. The Norfolk geology was examined carefully for any evidence of such a source. None was found. The geology beneath Swanton Novers Rectory was exactly what it appeared to be: standard Norfolk agricultural land, with no underground oil deposits, no mineral seeps, and no subterranean features that could account for the appearance of sandalwood oil or commercial petrol on the interior surfaces of a building. Standing on top of it, the chemists came with their equipment and their analytical rigor. They took samples of every substance they could collect from the rectory walls and ceilings. They analyzed those samples in their laboratories and reported back with findings that were, in their way, the most puzzling contribution to the investigation. Every substance was genuine. Every sample was exactly what it appeared and smelled to be: real sandalwood oil of commercial quality, real petrol of the kind sold in garages and hardware shops, real paraffin of the domestic variety used in lamps and heaters across rural England, real water of no unusual chemical composition, nothing manufactured, nothing exotic, nothing that pointed to any unusual or specialized source, just ordinary commercial substances in extraordinary locations, with no conceivable route by which they could have arrived there. The chemists were unable to offer any explanation for the source of the substances they had analyzed. They could say what the substances were. They could confirm that they were genuine and unaltered and of standard commercial composition. They could not say where they had come from or how they had appeared. On the walls and ceilings of a Norfolk rectory, the journalists who arrived were looking for a story, and they found one. The case was reported in national newspapers with the mixture of fascination and skepticism that characterized press coverage of paranormal events in the England of 1919. The articles were read by people across the country who were simultaneously intrigued by the specific details: 50 gallons of oil from the ceiling. Professional investigators unable to explain it and inclined to assume that there must be a simple explanation that the investigations had somehow missed. The press coverage brought more investigators and more theories, none of which resolved the fundamental puzzle of where the substances were coming from. What the press coverage also did was bring the case to the attention of the Church Times, the weekly newspaper of the Church of England, which published a commentary on the Swanton Novers events in its September 5, 1919 edition. The Church Times commentary was remarkable in its tone, less concerned with the supernatural aspects of the case than with the institutional failure that it represented. The commentary noted, with a dry precision that has survived the century since it was written, that the Society for Psychical Research had developed extensive methodology for investigating exactly this kind of case, that their skilled investigators could have been called in to examine what was happening at Swanton Novers, and that it seemed to have escaped the attention of everyone involved that this option existed. The Church Times was not suggesting that the Swanton Novers phenomena were supernatural. It was suggesting that they were being investigated with less rigor and expertise than they deserved. The Society for Psychical Research was never contacted. Their investigators never attended. The case proceeded without the benefit of the systematic, investigative methodology that the SPR had developed specifically for situations of this kind. And this institutional gap, the failure to deploy the most appropriate investigative resources at the most relevant moment, is one of the reasons that the Swanton Novers case remains as unresolved today as it was in September 1919. It was a journalist who first noticed the servant girl. She was 15 years old. She had been employed at the rectory before the phenomena began and had continued her work throughout the 30-day period, carrying out the domestic tasks of a household servant in a building that was simultaneously producing inexplicable liquids from its walls and receiving a steady stream of professional investigators. She was a background figure in the early accounts of the case, present but unremarked upon, a minor member of the household whose role in events was not initially considered significant. Then someone noticed that the phenomena followed her. Not always, not exclusively, not in a way that was so obvious it could not be missed, but consistently enough across enough documented incidents that the pattern became visible to the investigators who were paying close attention. When the servant girl moved from the kitchen to the hallway, the activity in the kitchen would diminish and activity would increase in the hallway. When she was in the upper rooms showed more phenomena than the lower ones. When she was absent from a particular part of the rectory, that part of the rectory tended to be quieter than the parts that she was in. This observation transformed the nature of the investigation in ways that the investigators found both clarifying and deeply uncomfortable. Clarifying because it suggested a mechanism, not a property of the building, but a property of the person, some kind of projection or emanation from the servant girl herself that was producing the physical phenomena in her vicinity. Uncomfortable because that suggestion pointed in a direction that Victorian and Edwardian investigative frameworks had attempted to systematize but had never satisfactorily explained. The idea that human beings could, under certain circumstances, produce physical effects in the world around them through mechanisms that current science did not recognize or understand. The concept of the poltergeist as a person-centered rather than place-centered phenomenon had been developing in paranormal research since the mid-19th century. Investigators who had studied documented cases had noted repeatedly that poltergeist activity tended to concentrate around specific individuals, frequently young people, frequently adolescents, frequently young women or girls, and that when those individuals moved, the activity moved with them. The Rarick Parish case had shown this. The Thornton Heath case would show it. The Enfield case would show it again decades later. The pattern was well documented enough by 1919 that any investigator familiar with the paranormal research literature would have recognized it immediately in what was being reported at Swanton Novers, but the SPR was never called, and the investigators who did attend were not, for the most part, familiar with the paranormal research literature. They were surveyors and geologists and chemists, specialists in the physical properties of materials, not in the behavioral patterns of reported paranormal phenomena. They noticed the association between the servant girl's presence and the concentration of phenomena. They noted it in their accounts, but they did not have the investigative framework to know what to do with it, and so it remained an observation. Rather than a finding, a detail rather than a conclusion, the servant girl herself said very little publicly about what was happening. She was 15 years old, employed in a household that was under significant stress, surrounded by investigators who were examining her building and increasingly examining her, with the particular attention that the association between her presence and the phenomena had generated. What she made of all of it, the oils running down the walls, the chemists with their sample bottles, the journalists with their notebooks, the rector and his wife trying to maintain the dignity of their household under circumstances that made dignity extremely difficult to sustain, is not recorded in any document that has survived. She was young and she was working class and she was female and she was at the center of something that nobody could explain and that everyone wanted to explain. And the historical record treats her accordingly as a detail, as a variable, as a factor in an equation that the investigators were trying to solve, rather than as a person with her own experience of what was happening around her. This is not unusual for paranormal cases of the period. It is one of the ways in which the history of paranormal investigation reflects the broader social history of who gets to be a subject and who gets to be an object in the accounts that time preserves. What can be said with some confidence is that the association between the servant girl and the concentration of phenomena was real enough and consistent enough to have been noticed independently by multiple investigators who had no reason to coordinate their accounts. It was not a single observer's interpretation. It was a pattern that emerged from the accumulated documentation of 30 days of activity, and that was visible enough in that documentation to be reported as a feature of the case rather than a coincidence. That had placed the Swanton Novers case firmly within a tradition of documented paranormal phenomena that researchers had been attempting to understand for decades, and it suggested that whatever was producing the oils and liquids in that Norfolk rectory was connected in some way to the 15-year-old girl who moved through its rooms every day carrying out her duties, unaware, or perhaps not entirely unaware, of the pattern that her presence was creating. The press, predictably, was less nuanced in its treatment of this development than the investigators had been. Several newspapers ran accounts that placed the servant girl at the center of the story in ways that were more dramatic and less careful than the evidence warranted. She became, in the popular coverage of the case, the focal point of a narrative that the newspapers found more compelling than the technical details of oil composition and geological surveys. A young girl at the heart of something inexplicable, something that followed her, and that she could not explain and could not escape. Whether she found that coverage frightening, or isolating, or simply bewildering, is another thing the historical record does not preserve. The theory that attracted the most serious attention from the investigators and the press was also the most prosaic: a garden syringe, the Church Times, in its September 1919 commentary on the case, noted with some acidity that the hissing sound that witnesses had occasionally reported preceding the appearance of the liquids was, as they put it, such as is made by a garden syringe. The implication was clear. Someone in the household, or someone with access to the household, was using a pressurized spray device to introduce the liquids into the rooms of the rectory through some means that had not yet been identified. The phenomena were not supernatural. They were the product of deliberate human action, probably by someone seeking to create an impression of the paranormal for reasons that remained to be established. This theory had the significant advantage of being the simplest available explanation. It required no revision of the investigative frameworks that the professional investigators had brought to Swanton Novers. It required no engagement with the paranormal research literature that the SPR had developed. It required only the assumption that someone in or around the rectory was systematically deceiving everyone around them, and the identification of that person and their method. The problem was that the theory, when examined against the specific evidence from Swanton Novers, generated more questions than it answered. A garden syringe is a tool for applying liquids to plants. It holds a limited quantity of liquid and requires manual pumping to produce the pressure that expels that liquid through its nozzle. To produce 50 gallons of liquid through a garden syringe in a single day would require thousands of individual pump strokes, would require an enormous supply of liquid to be stored somewhere in or near the rectory, and would require the person operating it to have continuous unobserved access to every room in the building throughout the day without being seen by the rector, his family, the investigators, or the journalists who were present throughout the 30-day period. The surveyor had examined the rectory thoroughly and found no concealed storage of liquid in quantities anywhere near sufficient to account for the volumes documented. The investigators had been present throughout the day on multiple occasions and had not observed anyone introducing liquid into rooms by any means. The rooms that showed activity had been examined before and after incidents and showed no evidence of any mechanical delivery system, no hidden nozzles, no concealed pipes, no apertures in walls or ceilings that could have served as delivery points. The garden syringe theory also failed to account for the pattern of association with the servant girl. If a person was deliberately introducing liquids into rooms using a mechanical device, that person would need to be present in the rooms showing activity. The activity concentrated around the servant girl. If the garden syringe theory was correct, either the servant girl herself was operating the device, a 15-year-old carrying 50 gallons of commercial oils and a pressurized spray system, through a rectory under the continuous observation of investigators without being detected. Or someone else was following her through the building with the device, also undetected, for 30 consecutive days. Neither version of the garden syringe theory was workable against the documented evidence. It was an explanation that sounded plausible in the abstract and collapsed under the specific weight of what the investigators had actually observed and recorded. The Church Times had offered it as the probable solution to a problem they found. Embarrassingly mystifying. The investigators who had been at Swanton Novers and who had tried to account for the evidence they had collected found it inadequate. Other theories were proposed in the press coverage and in the discussions that followed. The geological theory, some unusual natural seep of mineral oils through the Norfolk subsoil, had already been ruled out by the geologist's investigation. The structural theory, some concealed reservoir in the fabric of the building, had been ruled out by the surveyor's investigation. The chemical theory, some reaction between the building materials and atmospheric conditions producing the observed substances, was ruled out by the chemists, who confirmed that no known chemical reaction between the materials of which the rectory was constructed could produce sandalwood oil, commercial petrol, or refined paraffin. The Reverend Hayward, who had been documenting the events with methodical precision throughout the 30 days, reached his own conclusion about the adequacy of the explanations being offered. It was not a conclusion he had come to easily or quickly. He was an educated man of the church, committed to a rational and ordered understanding of the world, and the suggestion that something supernatural was occurring in. His home was not one that sat comfortably with his professional or his personal framework, but the evidence accumulated over 30 days, examined by professional investigators who had found no conventional explanation, left him in the position that every person confronted with the Swanton Novers case eventually reaches. There was no explanation, not one that accounted for all the evidence, not one that the investigators could agree on, not one that held up against the specific documented details of what had been observed in the rectory over 30 consecutive days. The Reverend Hayward made his decision in the early days of September 1919. He gathered his family and what they needed, and they left the rectory at Swanton Novers and did not return. A man of the church, the incumbent of a Norfolk parish, driven from the building that was both his home and his professional base, by something that nobody could explain and nobody had been able to stop. The rectory stood empty behind them, its walls and ceilings quiet now that the family was gone. The 30 days of phenomena apparently concluded. What happened to the servant girl after the family left is not recorded. She disappears from the historical record at this point, as background figures in extraordinary events so often do. She was 15 years old, and she had spent a month at the center of something that no one could explain and that had driven her employers from their home. And then she was gone from the accounts and the documents and the press coverage and the investigation reports, back into the ordinary world that the historical record preserves only for those whose names and positions gave them a claim on posterity. She may have known what was happening, she may not have. The question cannot be answered with the evidence available. The Swanton Novers Rectory case ended in September 1919 and was almost immediately forgotten, not because it was debunked, not because an explanation was found that satisfied the investigators and the press and the public. It was forgotten the way that many documented paranormal cases are forgotten, not through active dismissal, but through the simple passage of time, the accumulation of other events, and the tendency of human attention to move on from things it cannot resolve toward. Things that can dot the England of late 1919 had other things to attend to. The immediate post-war period was a time of political instability, economic disruption, and social change that competed vigorously for public and press attention with a 30-day outbreak of inexplicable oils in a Norfolk rectory. The influenza pandemic that had killed millions worldwide was still a recent memory. The political landscape of Europe was being redrawn in ways that would have consequences for generations. The specific puzzle of Swanton Novers Rectory, unresolved as it was, simply ceased to generate the attention it had briefly attracted, and was filed away in the archives of unexplained events, where it has remained ever since. What has survived is the documentation. The Reverend Hayward's records, the investigators' reports, the newspaper accounts, the Church Times commentary. These documents are sufficient to establish beyond any reasonable doubt that something happened at Swanton Novers Rectory between August 8th and September 8th, 1919 that professional investigators could not explain. They are not sufficient to establish what that something was, the theories that have been proposed for the Swanton Novers. Phenomena in the century since they occurred fall into several broad categories, none of which has achieved the status of a consensus explanation among the researchers who have examined the case seriously. The fraud theory, that the servant girl, or the rector, or some combination of household members were deliberately producing the phenomena, runs into the same evidential problems that the garden syringe theory encountered in 1919. The quantities documented, the locations involved, the continuous presence of investigators who observed nothing suspicious, and the physical examination of the building that revealed no concealed storage or delivery infrastructure, all make deliberate fraud an extremely difficult position to sustain against the specific evidence. This does not mean fraud is impossible. It means that the fraud theory requires a level of sustained, sophisticated, undetected deception that the Ruppent-Duverts does not straightforwardly support. The mass misperception theory that the investigators, the journalists, the rector and his family were all collectively misinterpreting something mundane as something extraordinary fails on the chemist's evidence. The substances were real. They were analyzed. They were identified. Whatever was misperceived, if anything was, it was not the nature of the substances themselves. The psychokinesis theory, that the servant girl was involuntarily producing the phenomena through some form of unconscious psychokinetic projection of the kind that parapsychologists had proposed as a mechanism for poltergeist activity, is consistent with the documented pattern of association between her presence and the concentration of phenomena, consistent with the broader pattern observed in other documented poltergeist cases, and entirely unsupported by any mainstream scientific framework for understanding human physical capacity. It explains the evidence without explaining the mechanism, which is a position that paranormal research has occupied in relation to poltergeist phenomena for as long as poltergeist phenomena have been studied. The unknown cause theory, that something occurred at Swanton Novers in 1919, that current science does not have adequate frameworks to explain, is the most honest position available given the evidence, and it is the most unsatisfying one, because it offers no closure and no pathway to understanding that what the Swanton Novers case represents in the broader history of documented paranormal phenomena is a case of extraordinary evidential quality that has been almost entirely neglected. It was documented in real time by a credible witness with professional standing, investigated by multiple specialists from different disciplines, reported in national newspapers and the Church Times, and produced no conventional explanation that accounted for all the observed facts. It shares its fundamental characteristics, the concentration of physical phenomena around a specific young person, the failure of conventional investigation to identify a source, the eventual cessation of activity when the household dispersed, with dozens of other documented poltergeist cases from the same period, and from other periods. It should be one of the most discussed paranormal cases in English history. It is instead one of the least known. A Norfolk rectory that wept oil for 30 days and then fell silent, in a summer that England was too exhausted and too preoccupied with its own recovery to pay adequate attention to the impossible thing happening in its midst. The rectory still stands in Swanton Novers. The village is still there, in its corner of North Norfolk, surrounded by the flat agricultural landscape that has changed less than most things in England over the past century. The building has housed other families since the Haywards left. In September 1919, it has not, as far as the available record indicates, produced sandalwood oil from its ceiling since that summer, but there is something worth considering as we leave Swanton Novers. The phenomena began on August 8th, 1919. They ended in early September 1919. They ended not because an explanation was found, not because an investigator identified their source and addressed it, not because a religious intervention or a scientific intervention or any other kind of intervention resolved whatever was causing them. They ended because the family left. The rector and his wife and their household departed, and the rectory went quiet, and the oil stopped running, and the investigations concluded, and the world moved on. Whatever had been happening at Swanton Novers appears to have required an audience. It appears to have required the presence of the household, and specifically the evidence suggests the presence of the 15-year-old servant girl to continue. When that presence was removed, the phenomena ceased. That observation is not an explanation. It is another question. Another thing that the Swanton Novers case asks and does not answer. Another thread that leads somewhere that the evidence cannot follow. 50 gallons of oil from the walls and ceilings of a Norfolk rectory. 30 consecutive days. Professional investigators who could not find the source. A 15-year-old girl. At the center of it, a rector driven from his home. And then silence. The case was documented. The document survived. The explanation did not come. It has not come yet. And in a rectory in North Norfolk, on a warm August morning in 1919, a woman looked up at her kitchen ceiling and smelled sandalwood where sandalwood had no business being. And the 30 days began, and nothing was ever the same again inside those walls. Some things happen. They are witnessed and documented and investigated with the best tools available, and they still do not resolve. They sit in their archives, signed and witnessed and reported and preserved, waiting for someone to find the answer that all the investigators missed. The rectory is still there. The question is still open.